I'm going to talk about the social networks and archival context project, and that is actually not what I came here to talk about, actually. I was going to give you the jaded view of someone who's spent close to 30 years modeling data in one context or another, but a lot of people expressed an interest in this project, and while I'm not going to go into the data modeling in any explicit way, I do think it raises all kinds of issues about the use of data models, what you can do with data that is smarter data than raw data that we were talking about before. I really don't like this display that PowerPoint's giving me because I can't see the, and I can't do anything about it. Let me stand out here, I'll switch, and then stand out here and speak really loudly. First thing I'd like to talk about is the funding and timeline for it. It's funded by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It began in a 2-year project, began 2 years ago, so it'll formally come to an end at the end of next month. But at the end, I'll talk about what might happen after that period. The people involved are myself and Worley Martin at the University of Virginia, Ray Larson at the University of California, Berkeley, and Brian Tingle and Adrian Turner at the California Digital Library in Oakland, California. Does anyone know how to, PowerPoint's a new one for me.
Not to brand myself as any kind of PowerPoint expert here. Can you?
You know what I'll do? I'll do this instead.
Just see the same thing that I can see.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was trying to get it to do, but it didn't want me to. I'm just going to go with this instead because I can see it. Can you all see it fine?
Is it mirroring the display?
It's giving me a little slide at the bottom with 2 panes, but I have no mouse. So I don't. Okay. I have a lot to get through here, so. Okay, so the project's objectives succinctly stated, on one hand, the audience in the community that I'm interested in are archivists and manuscript librarians, and having been involved for a long time in transforming what was an analog-based descriptive system into a machine-readable descriptive system. Part of what I'm up to here is furthering that process of creating a machine-readable environment for archival description. And this particular step involves taking the description of people that create and are documented in archival records and separating the description of them from the description of the records as such. But beyond that, it's also designed for the users of archives, which is to say many of you in this room and a fairly large portion of the scholarly world that's interested in things human, as well as a large portion of the general public. And so the first thing is in terms of enhancement, is providing integrated access to archival resources by and about or documenting a particular person, corporate body, or family. It's one of the holy grail is unified access. But the other thing that we're doing is we're providing the social professional context within which the people lived and worked. And you'll see this demonstrated if I don't run out of time. What we're doing and the data that we're working with is around 30,000 archival finding aids or guides descriptions encoded in encoded archival description. And then, in addition to that, we have authority records from the Library of Congress and authority records from the Union List of Artist Names from the Getty. And finally, that number there, actually of 5 million, we now are working with 16 million virtual international file records, which we use for matching purposes and to help in identity resolution. So the processing that we're engaged in here essentially is done in 3 steps. The first of which is done at Virginia, the second of which at Berkeley, and the third is done at the California Digital Library. But what we're doing is extracting information, the names, and when we can, the description of people, either as corporate bodies, persons, or families, from the archival description, and assembling that into encoded archival context CPF records. That CPF is corporate bodies, persons, and families. Then we subsequently match those records against one another in a process called identity resolution, and it's a bit tricky. So what you're essentially doing is, if you have the same name string or similar name strings, is it for the same person or not? And when we decide that it is for the same person, we're merging them together and then keeping track of all of the information and where we got it. And then subsequent to that, they're matched against, mostly so far, the virtual international authority file, where we pick up and go through the same identity resolution process and acquire and aggregate additional data that we find there. So you can see I just laid out the key challenge in that second bullet point. And then finally, taking the resulting set of these matched, merged, enhanced records, we're creating a prototype historical resource and access system, which is, the historical data, the social professional networks within which the people existed, but links to archive, library, and museum resources. The source data, as I've mentioned, just to say a bit more about it, are these EAD encoded finding aids created by archivists, manuscript librarians. And as they currently stand, they intermix the description of records with the description of creators. The description of the creators from an archival point of view is thought of as providing context for understanding the records. So you have these records that emanate from one source, and in order to interpret them, understand them, you need to know something about who created them and what was the context in which they were created. And some of these have very, very detailed description of the creators. They vary wildly. While the archival community has been engaged in this sort of ongoing process of becoming more standardized and normalized and more of a consensus, the quality of practice is irregular. So if you go to the Library of Congress, the finding aids there are created by the divine guidance of God, and most everyone else does something far more human than what they do at the Library of Congress. Many of the names are given but not identified as such, so some of the names are tagged, so easily found. In other cases, there's names, one would like to say, some of the contexts are in a natural language context, but the others, they're in a very strange context that's not natural language, but they're there. One of the things that we're focusing on is a lot of papers, private papers, have correspondence in them. And so we're particularly interested in if this person corresponded with this person, because then we can establish as a fact that they have some social professional relation between them. In other cases, we can't identify that, and I drop that into an ambiguous category. They're merely associated. Sometimes those associations are purely intellectual. So if someone collected Dante, for example, you'll see a link from this person to 20th century person to Dante, and you clearly know that they didn't know one another personally, but there's an intellectual relation between the two. Okay. I'm going to speed this up a little bit since I want to show you the demo, which is what most people want to see. This is a bit on archival records. One of the key things to know about them, Alan brought up the word intentionality yesterday, is archival records, well, and then went on to qualify exactly what he meant by intentionality, which was not what most of us assume he meant by the word intentionality. But records, by saying that records are the byproduct of people living and doing their work, is quite frequently the records we generate when we're doing a digital humanities project is we're intentionally building a digital humanities project, but in the process of doing that, we're sending emails to people, we're writing grant proposals, we're doing all kinds of other things that serve the purpose of building that humanities project. So the project out there is the intentionally built thing. And then these other things are byproducts of us following through on that intention. And so we have, in fact, the archive of a digital humanities project is all those records that document the creating of the digital humanities project. I was trying there to make this whole notion relevant to this group. I hope that succeeded. The underlying standard, in addition to the EAD, is this thing called encoded archive, this schema called encoded archival context, CPF. And again, it's designed for describing corporate bodies, persons, and families. It's based on the International Council for Archive standard, ISAR-CPF. It's an international group of people behind its design. And just a touch of what the tagging looks like in there. This is the identity section, and what you're seeing there is at the top an identity type, which is to say it's a person here, and then you have a name entry, in this case for Oppenheimer, and there is no such thing in this system as an explicitly top identified authorized form. You just have different names for the same entity, but there are ways to designate which of those names is the one you prefer within your catalog. Things like exist dates. Probably skip down that local description, language used by the person or languages used by the person, occupation or occupations that the person had. And then one of the things that you find frequently in these descriptions is what we call a chronological list, which is a sequence of rows with a date, a place, an event in them. There are ways of extending this, so if you wanted to type it in such a way to say, participate in a conceptually modeled world, you could do it. You can create timelines out of this. We haven't gotten to doing that yet. This would be a case of linking one person to another person. So the role here using a Ferber entity is to say that out at the other end of this is a person corresponded with, relation entry. A resource relation. Okay, so quickly, the year one extraction. This is a little bit out of date because I put these slides together a few months ago and we've done a bit more processing. But In essence, we've extracted close to 200,000 names from the 30,000 finding aids, and then winded those down to about 100 and, well, we'll see when I show you the prototype. I can't remember the exact number. Okay, now what's next in all of this? It's actually Judgment Day for me. I'll find out whether this next step goes forward today. But if so, we'll vastly expand both the research agenda and the source data. And it'll have at least a bit of an international flavor to it in terms of adding in a lot of data from the UK and a little bit of data from France. Also, taking place in parallel is an Institute for Museum and Library Services funded project where we're going to try to transform what we're doing into a sustainable national cooperative program. So I have a series of meetings set up to begin writing up a blueprint for what that would mean. And then finally, since I'm running out of time here, I'll have to cut and paste this since this is not active as a link. And unfortunately, it doesn't look very good because it wasn't designed for such low resolution. But, so it's about 130, that close to 200,000 reduced to about 130,000 names, which you can go in and search. We've featured some out here because a lot of things end up just being a name and not much else, linked to one resource. But for some of the more interesting people, I like to do Vannevar Bush since he's the hero of linking, thinking machine, the web, the cement, you know, everyone looks at him as the father. So here's Vannevar Bush. I can see here that he was an engineer, a physicist, a public official, a science administrator. I can read a biography of his life. I can go off to the right, and given the limited source data here, I've identified him in 9 archival collections. He's the creator of this collection here in the Library of Congress. He's referenced in 8 more here. In addition to that, he's also associated with these 46 people, these 19 corporate bodies, the additional resources found here, linked data here, so you can go off to a VF record, and we've had DBPD as well, so you can go off there. And then, you know, this is in the early stages, but everyone seems to like this. Here he is mapped into a radial graph. And the interesting thing about Vannevar Bush is you can find him connected with Robert Oppenheimer, who was the father of the atomic bomb, whom you'll find related to T.S. Eliot, whom you will find connected to Marx, but not Karl, but Groucho Marx, which makes Groucho Marx 2 degrees of separation from the father of the atomic bomb. I have no idea what that means, but, so I'll stop there. Questions? Yes.
So this problem of like normalizing people, right, is obviously one of the huge elephants in the room. So the other elephant in the room in the same
Literally and figuratively.
Sorry?
Normalizing people.
Yeah. Yeah. And there is no normalizing people. So in the same data, right, you have some other elements, like the locations, for example. Right?
Yeah.
So it's a very, very similar problem, and it would also be useful to do that, right? So are you dealing with that problem?
Yeah, Yeah, well, it falls into the category of identity resolution. So if you have two strings that you have reason to believe may be for the same entity, is then trying to algorithmically determine whether they're for the same entity, whether it's geographic or a person or a corporate body. And then the other thing is, and we're not dealing with this yet with geographic names, but the underlying encoding framework will support this. So what we want to do is we're going to take the timelines where we have events like he was born here, you know, did this here, and we'll process those and match them against a geographic name authority file, and do the same thing we're doing with the other names, and then we'll pick up the coordinate information. And then the idea is we take a chronological list and we can do a mashup with a timeline and a map. Okay.
Vannevar Bush is just like yesterday we had Mona Lisa as an example.
Yeah.
This is a very typical kind of example. Data models always use the ones where we have the most data. But the problem is if you take 20% where we have 80% of the data for, that might give you some solution which may totally not apply to the long tail of names where you have one document and one name.
Yeah.
How do you deal with
And under-identified, say with no, you know, birth date or death date or anything else. I mean, there's a few ways that you can do this from a processing point of view, and one of them is the context out of which you retrieve the name to begin with. So let's say you have a name string that shows up with this physicist and a name string that shows up with this physicist, and it's similar name strings. The fact that each of them is associated with two physicists may or may not help you tip the balance towards identity resolution. Typically what you do is you get matched candidates, and then you're looking for some evidence which you can weight, and then if you have enough accumulated weight in terms of the additional evidence, and you can slide this scale, and you also have to review and do recall relevance evaluation of what you're doing in order to sort of slide your algorithms. But you can get it pretty accurate. The people at OCLC Research have gotten quite good at this.
Are you doing this automatically? The assurance that if you have different...
Yes. At this point, it's all being done algorithmically. Yeah, by Ray Larson. He's. I can give you some citations, not off the top of my head, to some of Ray's work, but there's also a lot of other literature on the subject, and it involves reading all kinds of mathematical symbols at some point if you get into it.
That's a very interesting thing for data models, right? Because if you go down the tail, the second most frequent thing to having only one document would be two documents. Or say for people will be two countries which they are associated with.
Yeah.
And that would probably be, I don't know, 20% or 30% of the data. And for these 20 or 30% of the data, you have no decision whatsoever.
Yeah.
You should go
Yeah.
one way or the other.
Yeah.
And data models are more
Yeah.
from top. They usually don't think of like, how do I actually encode that I cannot decide if it should go this way or the other.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we would like to do and haven't done yet is encode a relation between two entities and say, maybe the same as. Okay, then if you started a national cooperative, those would be flagged for some human being to come in to see if they can find additional data and resolve it. Then you can envision easily a future in which, if you get all that off the ground, which we'll see, is add a social computing network to it so that the public can come in and make suggestions and say, that's my aunt so-and-so who was born County Cork, in this year, blah, blah, blah.
Michael? Question about the converse problem and whether it arises and if so, how you deal with it. You talk about how
Yeah, I know where you're going with this, Michael.
And I don't know enough about archival practice to know whether it happens in finding aids as it happens in post-graphic work. You have
People make mistakes.
You think
Yeah.
it's one person, and you later decide it's two or three.
Yeah.
You know, we don't have very much data, so we all go into homes, get three names, call
Right.
the same guy. Later you discover, no, one of them is a justice of the Supreme Court,
Yeah.
there's a poet.
And another was an archivist.
That's the line. Do you handle that?
Well, from our perspective, keeping two names apart when you're in doubt is better than merging them together because it obscures it. And so one of the things is you want to make sure that in terms of your matching and merging, that you're reliable. So one of the things we'll be doing, God willing, in the next phase of this is we have an outside person to go through and systematically, manually go through and check. And then OCLC Research is making available to us some software for quality assessment on it. And that's an absolutely critical piece of this. And the whole issue of identity resolution is, of course, it's absolutely critical. And it's a very hot topic in the IP world right now as they begin to implement ISNI and ORCID and other things that piece of it is.
So, Daniel, if I understood correctly, a large part of the project is to take large data sets from disparate sources and kind of pull them in. I don't recognize all those sources, but the ones I do don't share a common format. I don't even think they share really necessarily a common data model behind the format. How did you?
Well, which of the formats? I mean, where I'm extracting all the data at the moment is EAD. And again, if all goes well, also you have some archival descriptions, about 2 million of them.
The Library of Congress will hand you a record.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like an EAD record.
Well, Library of Congress is not going to do that, but WorldCat's going to give me marked bibliographic records, and you'll write a separate process for extracting the names and assembling the EAC-CPF. So, it's a different mapping.
So any particularly interesting observations on the different data models that you've had to suck in?
Mostly we're dealing so far with the EAD and the EAC-CPF, and then for the VIF, Getty has its own, and we've deciphered that and have mapping models for it. VIF has its own for doing its cluster records. And I mean, the way this is all done is Ray Larson has to index all of this stuff in Cheshire, his state-of-the-art XML indexing tool. So yeah, at the moment, the last thing he did was he already mapped over the schema for the VIF records, for example. It's all in all the data is coming in XML. And his latest development is he's created n-gram indices to 16 million cluster records. Yeah, but there's actually a cluster would be authority records from different places around the world that are deemed to be for the same entity in identity resolution. They aggregate them.
I'd like to come back to the issue of people being identical. For instance, it's a point of binary decisions. They're either the same or not the same. Once you get into geographical entities, for instance, like Max was alluded to, very rarely things are exactly the same as. They are mostly
Could you speak up?
Oh, I said as long as you are with persons, the decisions you can take are binary, same as or not. Whereas if you get into geographical entities, for instance, you have different degrees of similarity.
Right. Identity resolution is a whole different challenge there.
So what are your plans for coping with those, considering that there is a big discussion in the linked data community about all say as how to use them.
In a certain sense, we're completely punting on that. It's not part of our problem set as such. I mean, it's part of your problem set. Whatever you figure out, let me know.
That's very good.
This is collaborative. So.
We're already 10 minutes over time, and so please, short questions, short answers. Susan.
I know I can ask another minute. I wonder, with the visualization you had, is there a way for me to interpret that to show, so I can see exactly that relationship?
Not that particular paragraph, but essentially the relations we've pulled down into a stack of RDF triples, and we have a sparkle endpoint.
Right,
So if you know how to write sparkle, you can go in and query it.
But as a user, it would be really useful if once I see something, to say, let me see how that happened.
Yeah. Next iteration.
Next
Susan.
iteration.
I have a question concerning this visualization as well. The lines between the entities, are they qualified in some way, or does it just mean that
They have a simple qualification. They're not color-coded.
the one entity is mentioned in the record of the...
Yeah, well, when we can determine it, we'll say corresponding with.
Okay.
Otherwise, if we don't know, we just want to say associated.
Corresponded with actually means they did know each other.
They exchanged letters.
That's the two things you have, or
Yeah, that's the only two things we have. But say, put this into a cooperative and come up with a nice list of possible relations, based on some nice ontology, then it could be differentiated. But there's not enough data available to us to any reliable kind of way to be more refined.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. This seems to be the session with technical problems. I was intending to use my machine. The picture on my machine is rendered in a very awful way on this screen, so I'm glad to use Sid's one for my presentation on basically the EDM. This is what I'm intending to do. I'm trying to give you an idea of what this actually is and what it is not. I'm trying to show you a few examples of how we model object and context. I will be talking a bit about the way EDM is related to the linked open data paradigm. I'll say a few words on RDF, potential problems, limitations, and then to end with, I'll show you an example of an ongoing project and how we think scholars might make use of the EDM. So the EDM, where does it come from? Basically, it comes from Europeana, which was a reaction to what, back in 2005, the French perceived this way. The Google rat that was devouring European culture. So this then triggered a violent reaction by the former librarian of France, Jean-Noël Jeannonnet, who was perceiving this as a challenge of Europe being challenged by Google. And this again then triggered a political reaction, which, as you all know, led to the creation of a first prototype, which was launched in 2008 and immediately crashed quite spectacularly, which was helpful in a way, by the way. But since then, this first Europeana portal has been growing and is currently up to 20 million objects being represented. Still, this is basically just another portal. Nothing really spectacular and innovative about it. It's just lots of objects represented in a model which we chose because we had to be quick. The Commission had promised something in 2005 to happen in 2008. They did not know what they were talking about, so we came up with a very simplistic solution, the so-called Europeana semantic elements, which I'm not going into in detail, which euphemistically you could call simple and robust, but basically it had lots of limitations, and probably we should never have called it semantic, because that is definitely what it was not. This is what the ESE in essence is. It is still what we all know, at least librarians among us, a typical record-based model to represent metadata. Now, right after the launch of the portal, we started working on a different model, and that's the EDM I want to talk about, which basically is another metadata model, which is currently in the course of replacing the ESE. And it's a model, to be a bit more precise, for making statements about digital representations of cultural heritage objects. That's how I would define it. It's not about the actual objects, it's about digital representations, and it's a model for making statements, potentially conflicting statements. And the second objective of the model is to enable contextualization of such representations. Contextualizations in the sense of making this part of the linked data paradigm. Now, it is not, for all the TEI people in the room, it is not an object model. It is not competing with any of the object models. It may be combined with them, but it is not a model for objects. And it is not a record model like the ones we know from the librarian environment. It is a RDF graph-based model, and that has consequences which may be interesting for our workshop here. Because basically, trying to simplify a point that has been made yesterday already, the XML models we know basically model knowledge as trees, ordered trees, with all the problems that stem from that. And the schema languages, these are using no elements and types. They know this concept of validation and in a way contain a prescriptive aspect, which you do not have in RDF. RDF, graphically represented, rather looks like this, and it models knowledge as graphs, not necessarily directed graphs. And RDF has classes and properties. It has a inbuilt model of inheritance, and that way enables some kind of very simple deterministic inference, which makes all the difference, as I would see. This is something I will skip because I don't have time. There were a number of requirements and design principles, such as distinctions between object and representation, the object properties and metadata attributes, the necessity to have several perspectives of an object represented, support for composite standard formats for metadata with specializing options and the same applying to vocabularies, and the maximum reuse of existing standards. We did that in 3 areas. We heavily draw on SCOS for knowledge organization representation. We draw on the DCMI metadata terms, which is a much richer term set than the doubling core attributes. And the one we draw on most heavily is the OAI, ORE, Object Reuse and Exchange model, which is a graph-based model for representing complex objects on the web as aggregations of web resources. All that resulted in a class model, which is deliberately simple. We only model the upper levels of what you can actually model. And the assumption is that all of these classes here can be specialized the way I'm trying to indicate with the event here, for instance, you could prune the whole CRM E5 hierarchy below that event class here. And you could make similar choices for most of the upper classes, and the same applies to the properties. This is a rather simplistic property model, and it is meant to be top level, so to enable specialization by communities. Now you get Mona Lisa again, because this is the example we use in the primer, and we've seen it yesterday already. This is what it looks like on the web currently. This is how it looks at the French Ministry of Culture. And by the way, there is a second representation of this at the Louvre, so we need to have two views of this. And this is what it looks like basically in the EDM. There is a cultural heritage object, which we are referring to, which has digital representations, the thumbnails you've seen on the website, which has a proxy which binds all statements that have been made by one instance on this representation, and all this is pulled together by the aggregation node, which makes it a representation entity within Europeana. Now, using this model, you can do all sorts of things. You can do semantic enrichment. You can link, for instance, to an agent that is modeled on the web. You can work with time spans. You can link to external concepts. You can model events and things that happen in time using this model, such as, for instance, here, the event of the creation of the Mona Lisa at a given place, in a given time, or again, the event of the Mona Lisa having been stolen by François Ier. So you can model events, you can model more complex objects, you can model part-whole hierarchical relations, order among parts of objects, or, as is in this example here, derivation and versioning relations, like here, the two editions, which then can be modeled as the one being derivative of the other. Last example, here again, a marked record in its sheer beauty, which in Gallica looks like this. This is the way it looks in the digitized environment. And this is again how it looks in the EDM. The physical thing, the proxy with all the metadata, the digital representations, and the semantic context. I use purple for things that are outside Europeana, but which we link to. And the aggregation that binds all this together. We have confirmed feasibility, viability of this model in several workshops with all the communities involved. It is already deployed at data.europeana.eu. That's our linked data pilot. Specifications and publications are available, and for the more technical people among you, there is at Europeana Labs development documentation and a related ontology. So if you want to reuse the OWL, that's possible from there. Now this brings me to the second objective of the model, which in my eyes is the more important one, which is the contextualization bit. If you take again here the core of a EDM aggregation, this can have context. The aggregation is created by an agent. The proxy may be linked to a VIAF, a SCOS, or a geonames entity. And that way, on a more higher level, you get an image of Europeana being organized on two levels. The bottom level of networked object representations that would be modeled in the EDM, and the level above, the semantic network that would be used for contextualizing these networked objects. And the user is between these two levels and free to navigate horizontally and vertically, thus creating a user experience that is radically different from librarian opaque environments. And the charm of this is that this architecture, which we originally designed as a standalone architecture, can be plugged in this big cloud. This is the linked open data cloud that most of you will have seen in several presentations during the last months. This is the biggest contextualization resource on the world, and Europeana currently now is part of this. This was important for us, a lesson to learn, that we do not build another librarian silo, but try to be part of this bigger one. Now, if you do things this way, and this is where I link to the workshop, you get all sorts of interesting questions. To start with, a resource aggregation, where does it actually start, where does it end? Very difficult question. Or a similar question, what actually constitutes the document boundaries in such an RDF aggregation environment? I'm using colors here. That makes it intuitive. There are no colors in RDF. So you have to find some criteria to actually constitute the boundaries. Or, again, a really challenging one. Which of these nodes was connected to which other one at a given time? How to version all this is a real challenge. Or again, if you take two resources, the purple one here and the orange one here, you have context, which is directly related to them, first order links. And we would agree on this being context of these resources, but then there are other resources linked to these secondary links. Are these still part of this object's context? And if we try to version things, do we have to version this as part of the object's context? And what about all these things here that are somehow related to the secondary relations and then are shared between these two objects? Which one belongs to which, and which is context of which? And then if you take this again into the time vector, how do you version all this again? Challenging. But you get new opportunities. You can do some sort of very simplistic reasoning on RDF, as you all know. If you have, for instance, this triple here, which says that La Joconde is a painting, and a second one that says that paintings are a subclass of artistic work, we can infer that La Joconde must be an artistic work. That is possible for a machine to do. And this creates opportunities in the sense of very simple deterministic reasoning that may have some potential of enabling novel digital heuristics. Such an approach shares the pros and cons of RDF. There are pros. It's simple, it's lightweight, it avoids all the complications and heavy logic approaches of the former semantic web. It is robust, atomistic, and it seems to be scalable. But it has limitations. It has the limitations we've been talking about yesterday, namely the limitation of the triple syntax to actually express things like provenance and versioning without doing systematic reification, which the linked data people would like to avoid. So we have this discussion on the named graph we've mentioned yesterday already. And we have more complex problems, like the question I was just asking to Daniel. How do we deal with things like similarity? How do we express similarity between resources? or again, ambiguity, because this is the most important limitation in my eyes. RDF triple syntax is limited to, definitely limited to denotative modes of signification. Anything more complex than mere denotation, A has this name, is impossible to do in RDF. And then, of course, there is this huge LOD linking resource potential, but it's dirty data. It has big quality issues, and these need to be taken into account. Now, considering all this, we have kicked off 2 weeks ago a project with this logo. This is the new logo. It's called DM2E, Digitized Manuscripts to Europeana. And you see a reference to Europeana there, of course, in the logo. You also see, at least intended, a reference to the RDF model. And this is what it basically does. It provides digitized manuscripts to Europeana. It integrates existing technical building blocks to produce a production chain that would enable migration from any kind of structured source to RDF, to the EDM, and then automated contextualization. That again was a bit Daniel was alluding to. How do you automatically create links between an object representation and semantic context? And it has a third work package that may be interesting for this community here, where we go into the way humanities research could eventually build on EDM and more RDF data, eventually generating digital heuristics and making these data as well as these heuristics available to specialized environments like the one we'll be building there, which looks a bit like this. You have to the left all sorts of structured or semi-structured data sources we can take as input, Europeana being one of them. In the middle you have a platform, a prototype of this already exists under the name of Muruka, which was developed in the Discovery project, and which basically enables digital curation workflows, which enables semantic annotation, collation, text mining, data linking, mixing, augmenting, and which basically has a potential of being used by all sorts of community, but in this work package we try to experiment it with a digital humanities community, so as to combine things like what we have here. This is a fragment of a Wittgenstein manuscript, which we can contextualize. We can say it has been created at a given date. It has a web presence, which is part of another portal. It has an author in VIAF, who is author of something else, who has been living at a place when creating this fragment. And the idea is to combine these kind of information available from the EDM together with the actual digitized objects, which are not part of Europeana, in an environment that would use ontological granular representations of what John Answorth has called scholarly primitives and what Tobias Blanke and Mark Hedges have been publishing on again last year, to actually build what I would call a social semantic scholarly graph, in which the EDM data would be extended with RDF statements. Here's just a few examples of what you could come up there. Version A is successor of version B, or scribe Y copied from scribe Z, or statement 1 on the meta level contradicts statement 2. The verbs in these sentences would be modeled ontologically. And the question actually is what we could obtain from inferencing on such a graph, what kind of scholarship this would eventually enable, and what the limitations of such an approach actually are, because we've been speculating on this for quite some time, so we would just like to do a large-scale experiment. There's some related reading, and I think I have stayed in time.
As to the quality issue, I think this is a very crucial point for the scholarly community and the linguistic community. And I wonder what approach you choose to solve this problem. Can you please dwell a little bit longer on this issue, because I think it's very simple for accepting that sort of data evolve.
Well, the good news is that we do not have to solve this problem as a digital humanities community, because it's part of a bigger agenda. There is this whole linked open data community, which is quite visible in the web architecture today, and which have recognized that solving this quality problem is essential, hence all the discussions we have about our SAMAS and its use. So I would be optimistic in the sense of if that problem cannot be solved by that larger community, we have a really big problem on the web as a whole, which we then share with the web as a whole. But the choice is to make our environment part of the generic web architecture. Well, that may be the crucial point, whether that is actually possible, because the RDF model, like so many computer science-inspired models, has a built-in semiological limitation. It's in a way a nominalist regression on a very high technical level. It's just about things having names. And that's why I'm unsure whether it is possible in aggregating lots of RDF statements to transcend this limitation to denotation in producing an approximation to, for instance, connotative modes of signification. No one knows, but at least I would like us to work with some consciousness of this problem. Yes, consciousness of this problem.
Is the sort of thing you're referring to that some names as well as having denotation have a sense, breaking a sense or a meaning?
Yep. Yep. I mean, in allowing contradictions and ambiguity, we may get somewhere. The question is how to deal with these on inferencing level. Because the inference machines that we have, of course, are built on non-ambiguous and non-contradicting sets of statements.
As one of the persons who probably has one of the largest varieties of source data sets, right? So you're probably in a position to actually be one of the persons who could actually evaluate the say, you know, how does the source data fit to the Europeana model? Do people abstract too much? Do people, you know, pick a low-hanging fruits, or are they too complicated and stuff like that? Do you see something like a feedback process where one could say, okay, this is how we get the data, and now to make it better, we have to go back to the providers and say, you know, so do we have an idea how this could work? Because honestly, nobody likes the
pathologist who says, you know, it'd be great if you could do this and that, right? Because the answer would always be, yeah, we don't have money for that.
We have such a feedback mechanism built in the DM2E processing chain. The idea is that the digital humanities scholars working in the specialized environment would be able to feed back to the data providers or to those that did the automated contextualization that they have done or not done useful things. So there is a feedback loop built in the project, which is small scale. Whether we can do the same thing on Europeana level depends on whether Europeana accepts this idea of being complemented by another specialized platform that would provide functionality Europeana doesn't want to provide on portal level. We have Europeana as partner in the project, and the idea is that sustainability of this project's results would be obtained by transferring results to Europeana. So there is this perspective of growing what we do in a small-scale approach to the project to the European level as a whole. But that's the perspective.
I wonder whether there's a way in which the contents of scholarly data sets of historical materials could also serve as context. In other words, the Women Writers Project has however many documents that presumably attest to some of the information that you're trying to enter. What in practical terms would be involved in using that kind of data?
That's one of the crucial technical questions. In more generic terms, it's about the coexistence of the RDF and, for instance, TEI data, and how you relate these to each other. How you point from an RDF statement to a given point in a TEI-encoded document, for instance. This is something we would like to find out. It's part of the work package, and I mean, there are RDF representations of TEI around, and this may be one of the ways to go. But this is something we would be very happy to have advice on by others. I wonder whether there have been experiments here by people in the room regarding coexistence of RDF and TEI-based models. That's one of the crucial questions.
I guess just to add to my comment, I was also wondering whether projects that use TEI internally or other markup systems internally might broadcast or expose data in an RDF form, and that might provide another kind of boundary layer.
I would be careful with the term expose. If that means replication of data, no. But if that means giving the same data a second face,
like OAI.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thanks again.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start off by saying that I hope there's still some appetite for picking up some of the questions that were left hanging at the end of our wonderful discussion this morning. I'm actually not going to give the talk that I thought I was going to give. I've kind of massaged a little bit so as to respond to some of the issues that came up, which were along the same lines that I wanted to talk about anyway. I should also mention, sort of at the beginning as a caveat, that this might feel like something of a thump down from the heights that we've been sort of scaling so far. I sort of wanted to talk about, I've called my talk Discovering Our Models, and I want to think about how we go about developing these models by sort of telling a story of doing TEI customization and thinking about the ways in which the data model starts to come into view or to cohere as you work through this in a sort of practical sense. But I want to start with this quote from Wendell, from his article on the distinction between descriptive and procedural markup, where he says that an effective markup language will work by establishing a self-contained, internally consistent and clear set of categories perfectly sufficient for handling the data set to which it will be applied within the range of applications for which it is due. But this ideal is impossible for a truly descriptive language to achieve. And I think we've seen that quite strongly in our discussion so far, since the world is not a closed, finite set of phenomena that is liable to such treatment. Metaleptic markup, which is the sort of category he's proposing in this article as a sort of excellent place that we might aim at, gives us the next best thing. It invents its own imagined world, proposing earnestly or ironically that this serves both sides, both accounting for external reality as it is and creating as it needs to be. And the idea there that when we're working with pre-existing materials, when we're trying to describe a set of documents that we might be working with, we're both interested in giving rich and provocative and interesting descriptions of those materials inside a system that we're also thinking of validating, that we're enforcing certain rules against so that we can do something with these descriptions that we've created to create sort of new data or future information, future ideas. And that, I think, is my perhaps poor paraphrase of Wendell's metaleptic markup idea. And so the question I want to ask is, how do we get there? And more specifically, how do we get there from here? This is a page of Frankenstein, a manuscript that both Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley worked on. It's part of a set of documents that we're currently working with at MIF, along with our partners at the Bodleian Libraries, the New York Public Library, Huntington Libraries, and the Harvard University Libraries, on a project called the Shelley Godwin Archive, which is bringing together as many of the extant manuscripts of the Shelley family, principally Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley, that we can get our hands on, and creating a digital archive of these materials, reuniting them from the physical archives where they currently live. And so for this project, we are creating a customization of the text encoding initiative suitable for describing these documents that we're working with. And for those in the room who are not familiar with the TEI customization mechanisms, the TEI offers a way to modify the schemas that you can validate your documents against. And you describe your customizations in a TEI document itself, which is then processed against the TEI source files, and you can do things like removing elements, adding new elements, modifying the attributes and other sort of characteristics of your schema. So we're thinking about creating a customization for these documents. And we were inspired by the recent discussions in the TEI community about representing manuscripts, about the genetic encoding work that's been done. So we started from thinking about, since we have these wonderful images of these very fragile documents, which apparently are very difficult to access in their physical manifestation, that we might focus our encoding on representing as carefully and as interestingly as we could these physical documents themselves, rather than trying to create a reading text or some conceptual version of the text that was more about the literary and linguistic structures. We wanted to think about the physical structures, the documentary structures. But what happened as we started to work through the project is we sort of found ourselves working up from the diploma. We took a model very similar to the one that Gregor was showing yesterday, where you have surfaces and zones and lines. These are, again, sort of following from the TEI's current way of modeling this information. And we sort of put that customization in place and then began to work through our model. And it's at that point that things begin to get interesting. You can put enough of a customization in place to get yourself up and working, to make sure that your encoders are perhaps all agreeing on the certain outlines of a problem. But then you sort of have to be focusing in more closely on what are the things that are actually of interest to you. And so when I talk about working up from the diploma, we started off, marking very carefully the lines and all the sort of interesting meta marks that you find on these pages, and finding this sort of very careful diplomatic transcription somewhat unsatisfying for the purposes that we were trying to work towards. Not to say that it's not a valid goal in and of itself, but we found that we weren't really after diplomatic transcriptions, partly because we'll have these wonderful images sitting right alongside them. And so that's a factor to consider, the ways that these different data representations sit next to each other and rub up against each other. And so what happened is that we eventually stopped marking certain of the meta marks, and I'll just give one example, which is around deletions, the ways that certain paragraphs or sections of the text are canceled out. We were encoding information that described exactly how those cancellations looked on the page, where the cross outlines went and exactly what kind of information was contained there. And it wasn't really answering the questions that the scholars who were working on the project were interested in. They were really interested in the dialogue that these physical documents represent between Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley during the composition of Frankenstein. And so we found it more useful to record, we were recording all along both the markings that indicated deletions and the deletions themselves. So you can represent that there's a meta mark indicating a cancellation, and you also have a separate set of tags for indicating that something has in fact been deleted. And those are two slightly different statements. And we found ourselves sort of dropping the statements about the meta marks and the careful description of these sort of drawings on the page. Whether that was a good decision or not, I guess we'll find out. But we found ourselves then not really being able to say that we were dealing with diplomatic transcriptions, but we were dealing with, again, a different selection of features that was hoping to indicate more clearly the sort of interplay of deletions and insertions, the moving around of the text as a conversation between these two writers. And that sort of leads us to ask, and I guess this is where I was having trouble with our conversation this morning, that we seemed to be circling around a definition of usefulness, where we were saying that putting less information into the documents made them more useful to more people. And I was having trouble with that definition of usefulness. That the less information we put in, the more people could use them for their other purposes. Whereas really, we were finding that the scholars in this project wanted to use markup, wanted to use data modeling, to engage in a conversation with other scholars in their field about the development of this text, and that therefore it was actually helpful to us to put more interpretive judgments into the text so that people could disagree with us, so that people could fight against our model, and that is a perfectly valid and scholarly reuse of our material, reuse of our markup. That I think the demands of interchange, or the sort of seeming size of the interchange problem, perhaps distracts us from a sort of humanistic approach to this endeavor of doing markup, where we're not really interested in providing the most minimal sort of interchangeable representations, but as Steve has said about text analysis, we're interested in provoking more arguments, making more interesting readings, and in some cases that requires very carefully and perhaps elaborately encoding our interpretive judgments right into the supposedly clean data. And I wanted to sort of think about that from the perspective of information science. And this is from some work that people at the Center for Informatics Research and Science and Scholarship at the University of Illinois have been doing, where Alan works. This is a paper by Carol Palmer, who's the director of that center, and Nicholas Weber and Melissa Cragen, where they're talking about some studies that they did of reuse of scientific data in these new big digital repositories of data. And they're drawing on an information science researcher called Birger Hjorlund, who wrote about something called the epistemic potential of documents. And they're thinking about how to apply this to collections of data in order to assess whether we're doing a good job at digital preservation or data curation. And I think the interesting thing here is this idea of transfer of knowledge and where that happens, and where in the process of building up a model we begin to transfer knowledge, and how we think about the different ways of making that happen through the act of modeling. And I think this ties in very closely with the conversations that we've been having about validation. How do we know when it's good enough? And is that the same question as how do we know when it's valid? And that in turn is related to this larger question that I want to point out from both literary studies and scientific data of the point at which we begin to transfer knowledge. And there was in our discussion this morning, we got into, I thought, an interesting part of the conversation about the interaction between a data model and the activities that go on around the data model. And whether there's a point at distinguishing what of that is still data modeling and what of that is something else. And so in the process of writing a TEI customization, you can write your odd file, which is how you encode your customization, and it seems very clear that you're speaking about the data model. What kind of things exist in your documentary universe? But you're at the same time keeping track of how people will use the system that you are building. So it's less helpful to think about it as a document and more helpful to think about it as a program that has certain interfaces, that has certain behaviors, even at the level of writing your supposed data model. You're thinking about if your encoders are working in a program like Oxygen, which will read the schema and provide them certain help as they're trying to encode the document, what kind of information you can put in your model so as to prompt the program that your encoders are using to encode their instance documents to do certain things or not do certain other things. And this is, I think, distinct from the level of just what the schema tells them they can and can't put in, because there's a level at which you can specify that behavior on a sort of valid or invalid level, and then there's a level you're trying to govern at more of a behavioral level or a community level. And I think those interchanges are interesting. And the way in which the data model there is working at transferring knowledge in different ways to different audiences. And this goes to the question of sort of how we document our data models. And working with TEI customization projects, certainly working with the documents in the Shelley Godwin archive, the TEI has a wonderful mechanism not only of writing these customizations, but at the same time you're writing the customization, you can write the documentation right along with it. You can produce beautiful versions of it in multiple formats, and you can do all those wonderful XML things. But that doesn't seem like fully documenting the data model. You don't seem to have captured what you set out to do. So I would argue for a sort of richer sense of what it means to document a data model that encompasses things like the validation routines themselves. So not only the actual schema itself, the instantiation of your conceptual model, but the programs that run against that model, the programs that run against instance documents encoded against that model. In addition to the sort of prose and the shared behaviors, which you work out in encoding the documents that you're working with in your archive. And that really, to describe the data model, you need this broader set of documentation. You need to have the programs, and this, I think, sort of ties into the things that Carrie was talking about yesterday. When we talk about digital preservation and we understand things like representation information, we try to draw boundaries around what are all the things we need to make sure we've stored away somewhere in order to preserve this object through time. And so things that look like documents, like TEI documents, are of course sort of, in a sense, programs. That in itself is not surprising. But sort of putting this, going through the process of customization and understanding the ecosystem within which that customization works will allow us to give fuller descriptions to collaborators such as librarians and archivists of exactly what it is these objects of scholarship are, what it is that they need to model in their systems of archives and libraries and digital repositories. And I kind of want to leave my talk a little short because I'm very interested in people's responses to this, thinking about the ways in which customization, the putting in of actually more information can spark, through both automated and human means, a sort of richer notion of data modeling, or a data modeling that participates in the humanities in a different way than we've been speaking of before, not simply the interchange of cultural heritage objects, but a real participation in the humanistic debate that we know from disciplines that are not explicitly digital. So I'm interested to hear and have further conversation around these topics. Thank you.
What a surprise.
Sorry. I like this idea of documenting the data model as well as documenting the encoding schema, the encoding practices. I've seen a beautiful realization of this idea of yours. In 2006 at Digital Humanities in Paris, there was Gauthier Poupeau that presented his documentation of data model using METS files, which we have also used at King's, a few project of ours. Basically what we do is that which XML goes against which XSLT to produce which HTML, use which JavaScript, which CSS. So the full processing, that was for preservation issues, of course. So not just in that sense, I don't know if it is exactly what you think, but you were thinking about the data model, but together with the full documentation of the encoding, which can be very beautifully described by ODD, as you said, not only the scheme, how you build it, but how you use it, and how you have encoded, which is the meaning of your encoding, and how to get from here to there. But there is also this aspect, how you tool the beautiful website and the stuff you work, and why it works like that. Mm-hmm. So we experimented with METS, that's the idea.
Right, and that's a very interesting example, and I think it is perhaps even a better example than the ones that we've generated so far with Shelley Godwin, and I think it covers a lot of the things that I was trying to bring up, but also points to the absence that I'm still pointing at, which is that I've often found when doing a TEI customization, there's always a certain point at which you stop specifying at greater and greater detail, where you could logically go on. So, in other words, even the odd file, even the programs and the behaviors are perhaps not capturing all the modeling work that's going on, because part of it is social, that's not actually enforced by the tools, but is part of the sort of a reenactment of the project, and looking for other ways to grasp at that information.
On the other hand, the more you scare me.
I know.
The more we invest in the idea that our executables are an important part of our electoral contribution, the more committed we are to the incomprehensibility of our electoral contribution. We don't know how to talk about dynamic process. We don't know how. We don't know how to preserve executables, except in very difficult and very flawed ways. So you scare. Give me some quotes.
I don't know if Wendell.
Fine is only if you want to carry on speaking, you come in the middle.
I don't know if Wendell wants to offer hope, but maybe if he does, then I'll go first because I don't have anything to offer. I wonder whether, yes, that seems to be true, and yet it seems important to point at the loss that is then incumbent upon us, that we maybe become in all the dialogue around sort of interchange and independence from any particular platform, that we've become sort of too confident in that we are saving what we think we're saving. And that a sort of clear acknowledgement of the loss of the things we don't yet know how to preserve is a sort of interesting thing to consider, and perhaps even to mark out in our models, that which will be lost at certain, strategies of preservation, you might say.
Wendell. Yeah, I would accept that, and I also think, to me, among the many wonderful things in what Trevor just presented to us is, for me personally, the reminder of what I was thinking about 10 years ago when I wrote that article at the site at the beginning, which is that to talk about these things within the tradition of rhetorical theory and poetic theory, and to understand that when we create these things, we're actually engaged in a kind of rhetoric and a kind of performance, right? And that with respect to that, and with respect to the problems that Elena and Michael and you are pointing to with this notion of documenting the data model, I think the thing to keep in mind is that what we're presenting is actually something that is, it has many parts, but it also has a whole to it. And that in some respects, the risk of documenting the data model, not that that's a bad thing, but the risk is that we then move the gravity of our work away from the production itself into the documentation about the production, which is always a risk with humanities, I think, but it's something that's especially kind of ironic and interesting when we're doing such fabulous things with the text that we're working with and the encodings of those texts and the performances that we drive on top of those encodings, right? Which have a kind of, they also speak to what we're trying to say, which I think is one of the most important things that you were reminding us of, is that this is not something that, we're trying to sort of have the last word, even though we always are, right? I mean, there's always this idea that I'm going to say the thing, and then it'll have been said, and everybody will then refer to me, right? But the reality is that they're going to talk back. And in fact, if, I think that, the interesting thing about the transition that we're seeing now in terms of the evolution of the humanities as a whole is that we're moving away from that notion that any individual scholar is going to have the last final word, or that that's the proper aspiration of the scholar. And that instead, even though we're, in a sense, going to sort of privately entertain ourselves with that idea, we also don't take it fully seriously, and we understand that part of the purpose of our trying to have the last words so other people can speak back to that. And in that, I think that documenting the data model is all very good because it speaks to other specialists, but the data model itself encompasses the work, and the work is something to a broader audience potentially as well, not just a fellow scholar. So, come back to that.
So, if you,
yeah.
Do you want to say something, or what?
No, Sid is frowning, so I want to get to that.
But I'm not frowning at you, Trevor.
Well, no, it's a thoughtful frown. That's all I was saying.
So I want to admit up front that I don't know how to model what I'm about to say, because it's indirect speech. Michael asserted that we have difficulty documenting processes, and I'm wondering why Michael says that. I don't want to say, what do you mean we, Kimasabi, because I might have trouble documenting processes, but Michael, I've read your documentation of processes, and it's pretty good.
Okay, I'm sorry, I think Laurent said I had the if the fan is making it hard to hear me, I didn't mean to be serious or mystical. I just mean the difference between proving the equivalence of two sets of declarative statements, which is a difficult but soluble problem, and proving the equivalence of two Turing machines, which is a difficult and insoluble, in the general case, problem. data, and yet whenever I look at strange data, I want to say, yeah, can you show me how you're using this? Because I don't understand what you're doing here. And once I see the website, it's, oh, okay, so yeah. Now that helps. So it's very helpful, but you know, if you give me a Fortran executable or a COBOL executable, and this is not a fantastic thing. There were, 12 years ago, 13 years ago, there were a lot of people trying to make new versions of existing programs and prove that they would behave exactly the same way, except that they wouldn't die on January 1st, 2000. Well, and that's a hard problem because who knows why? It's part of a gap in our logic, a gap in our heads. It's talking about the way processes execute is hard.
Well, and there's also sort of two things going on there. I mean, there's the concern about being able to, assert an equivalence between two processes, which we say is hard and possibly not doable, which seems to be a concern about preservation or sort of that this thing hasn't been tampered with, it's still the same thing that someone put in. And then there's the way that this sort of bids participation in the humanities, which is we're not really interested in the equivalence of the one process to the other, but the response of one process to the other, the way that those performances respond to each other. And those are two sort of threads going on there.
I'm not sure how to frame this question. I want to get back to what Wendell was saying, because I think there's an interesting mapping onto what we think about as different kinds of scholarship or different layers of scholarship. And I was very struck by your invoking the sort of performative rhetorical aspects, because one of the things that struck me in our conversations yesterday was a kind of a Matthew Arnold style distinction possibly between the sort of the Hellenistic and the Hebraistic, or the thinking and doing in a kind of crude way. And I think I've always been aware of myself and as being the kind of person who ought to be a scholar because I'm so bad at doing things in real time. Right? And so it's good that I get to write them down. And that's why events like this always make me very nervous, because here it is, it's all happening in real time. But I wonder whether when you say the data is the work and that the documenting the data is in effect some part of another discourse, a meta discourse that is aimed at another audience, I wonder whether that sort of piques my interest, because there is this ongoing question of where the scholarship is in digital scholarship. Is it in the creation of the data? Is it in the annotation of the data? Is it in writing about the data? Is it in documenting the data? And I feel fond of the idea that in digital humanities, documenting the data is actually the distinctively scholarly aspect, or one distinctively scholarly marker. And not that doing the data isn't also scholarship, but I wouldn't want to sort of sequester off the documentation as somehow too expensive an indulgence or too, Hellenistic, whatever that means.
Absolutely, and I'm perfectly with you on that. But at the same time, the proof of the pudding is that it's delicious, right? And we're beginning to see that. I mean, we are beginning to see that in the humanities stuff. These projects that are manifestly interesting to people who aren't deep, don't have their heads in the encoding.
The hack speaks louder than the yak.
Well, and I think that part of the reason that's happening is that for two reasons. Number one, the infrastructure is just strong enough. After all this work we put in, it's strong enough to actually support activity which does speak. And we are able to communicate to the larger world, even in that human way. And it's interesting that it's taken so long, but nevertheless, it is delicious. To the extent that there's an emphasis within the digital humanities on documenting processes and figuring out how we're going about doing this, and developing standards to allow others to replicate and to build on this information. That's all really very, very important, because that's how we're going to have this work be sustainable. And yet, on the other hand, there has been there's been this counter emphasis within the community on doing this as if it's, as if it's kind of, we're eating biscuits because we're hungry.
Right, but if we talk about this really well, then yeah.
That's not a bad thing. And on the contrary, I think that that all of that work which we do with each other is is profoundly important because we're going to learn how to do our own work better. And yet at the same time, you can't forget that there is something that we're trying to communicate.
Well, and not to get too lost in the metaphors, but also to veer away from the food. I mean, when you're giving your Lego analogy, I don't know if anyone else had this problem, but in my Lego sets, there were always ones that got stuck together and they were kind of clumpy and you could never really get them apart again. And yet those became interesting pieces for future constructions. And, I guess I'm arguing a little bit for the sticky Legos, but.
Stephen.
Come here, over here, Steve.
You seem to have much better ears than we.
I'm still stuck on this moment of this presentation where you said, they're kind of groping for what they're doing. Why are we doing this? And they finally decided that what they're doing is they're trying to enable a conversation with other scholars about their choices. That's a paraphrase of what I heard. Is that accurate? Some sentence like that here in the paper.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, so they want to, and I have some choices here, meaning that things like this scribble over here is Percy Shelley and not Mary Shelley. Or this cross out must refer to this regard.
Well, yeah, the more interesting examples are, this was written first and then crossed out, and you get, so it's a bit more about stages is the interesting thing. But
and as they're going along, they're paring down. It's like, only certain things are relevant. Only certain things in the odd file or in TPI are relevant to this. You should mark some of this in odd files.
right, but I mean, I guess I don't think I'm agreeing in the sort of universalizing sense that I think you're headed toward, but.
Well, where I'm headed is it seems to me that we would have, maybe, we would at some point have to say why data modeling is the best access to that, is the best way to enable that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Because in this case, we're not talking about enabling future processing of data. We're talking about, they've decided what they're doing, what it's about. And you really, someone has to convince me that really like odd customization is the way to enable that conversation, as opposed to saying, there are these 6 cruxes in this text where it's really strange, really interesting from the liberator point of view. We're going to list them and talk about them, and we invite you to talk back. That's a very, is that really like vastly inferior, totally flawed, as opposed to saying, no, we're going to ensconce this in a TPI.
Yeah.
That's an amazing thing.
Well, I don't think I was trying to make that argument that the TI encoding model is a better way to do it than the way.
But this is sort of what we're talking about in this poster, right? I mean, we want to make a claim that for certain kinds of intellectual affordances,
Yes.
for data model.
Yes.
And this is actually, here's a case where I don't see it actually. I really don't.
Well, I think we'd have to get.
I don't see it over other kinds.
Yes. Well, and I would say at the moment it's an open question, and we have to get a little further along in the project before we could really argue back and convince you. I have some confidence. Well, no, but I mean, I guess I want to argue that whether or not it's a better way or a less good way, there is an interesting way in which data modeling is another way of approaching this text and sort of communicating our choices about it that opens up further scholarship in a different and perhaps useful and interesting way than our sort of just writing about it. And in other words, in this deletion business. Well, partly because you're sort of enforcing the enforcement of the system and the way that interplays with. Sorry.
And because it puts that
Many people.
Yeah.
Can I have an answer on Trevor Muñoz? It's not necessarily better to have an encoded text than an article that says these 6 cruxes are really interesting. But I've read an awful lot of articles saying, well, you have to pay attention to the cruxes. But I am not going to commit myself by saying what I think those are. Whereas an encoded text
that's along the lines that we're going, but I mean, I think we can acknowledge Steve's point that yes, we have to prove it.
I would like to try taking a slightly different tack. I find it fascinating to acknowledge that the inclusion of the performative aspect of what we do when we deal with data should actually be reflected in data models. But then, of course, there comes this question of cost-benefit analysis. How much effort do you want to put into documenting the process and reflecting the process versus dealing with the primary source object that actually initiated the entire chain of processes or the network of processes that you get involved in? And I think we're obviously not the first to encounter that problem. Just look at the history of literary studies over the past 50 years, where we progressed from a positivist to a structuralist, to a post-structuralist, and eventually to a deconstructionist paradigm. Now, once I'm in the deconstructionist DH paradigm, I don't give a damn about the original source objects any longer. I'm so obsessed with myself. What I'm doing, how great it is, and so forth. And hey, that might be what really does the trick for me. Whereas somebody else who is rightly or wrongly labeled as an absolute conservative and traditionalist will say, this is not for me. I'm actually dealing with a text or a monument or what have you. I think it's a question of philosophical premise that we touch upon here, and we have to make a decision, each and every one of us, how far along the line we want to go. The second question, of course, is, and that's perhaps the more pragmatic one, that we should start investigating some criteria for making this cost-benefit analysis. I mean, for example, what you just said, Michael, if it helps to stop the waffling, I, for one, am all for it. Right? But that's just me. Somebody else might say, hey, I don't know. So I think perhaps we have to shift the focus of attention away from just dealing in assumptions and likes and dislikes, and more towards establishing criteria that will enable us to determine how far along this route we want to go, and where we say it's now becoming non-productive. We're actually circling around ourselves, and there's no progress.
Where's my kid?
Just wanted to point out, maybe we are not really talking about data modeling at all here, because I think if you have a very traditional edition, printed edition, you said, I'm not so much interested in what's really on the page, but what's happening behind that. And many people say, yeah, but that's not really an edition. So maybe we are talking about different sets of standards, and they are not really relating to the question of data modeling, but what do you want to achieve with what you're doing? Is it a comment on something, or is it an edition which provides other to comment on the text? And I think, in a way, you started out with this edition, what you described, and then on the way you changed where you go.
Can it be both though?
Actually, I think then you're mixing up things which you shouldn't do, because it's much easier to point if you say, this is the edition part, and this is my comment part. And then you say, okay, your comments I totally disagree with, but thanks for the addition. Julia.
I think also there's a question of scale at stake here. I mean, Trevor's example shows a single manuscript with 6 cruxes in it, perhaps, or whatever the number is, but it's a small number. But I think if you had been proposing to us, for example, the Faust edition with, God help us, probably hundreds of thousands of revision sites and so forth, the question of what kinds of things get revised here becomes a kind of question that you really need the markup for, right? And you also potentially need to be able to debate about the markup for. And I think that sort of much larger case might be an interesting use case to sort of address the question that Steve is raising. I mean, certainly when someone comes to me as a TEI person and says, I want to encode this poem so that I can study this poem. I'm like, well, why don't you just study the poem? You don't need TEI for that, Right. But if they come to me with 100,000 calls,
Right.
then it seems like there's another kind of problem.
Right.
Yeah.
But then we moved into, like, then we are explicitly imagining processing the data. This is what very shaking out the data. Like, right at that moment, we now moved over from, well, we're interested in questions. Now, we need a machine to deal with that, to just show us basically, so we can process kind of line. But when I kiss, Trevor waving his hand, we're all waving our hands on this one, right? I mean, this is me, including me. I mean, it feels like a kind of big question mark in the conversation. But I don't think in this context we want to treat data modeling and its intellectual affordances and scholarly worth and all of that as some kind of assumption. And actually, it's why the talk is so interesting. It feels like kind of breaks out this uncomfortable moment in our
Susan? I'm just getting things. Eleanor was there. Then Jack, and then
Data model is a very generic word in that sense, and which goes to the question which actually we put in online, which is the edition. And if it is actually just the XML that we have to document, or everything else we have to document, which was a little bit what I was at the beginning saying. I've been saying quite a lot lately that in my opinion the edition is not the XML. It's not the HTML, it's not the CSS, it's not the XSLTs altogether. Because you cannot take one or the other without looking at the other, because XML will not convey the way to use the thing. It's very complex, and say that you can separate things is very difficult as well. So you cannot say, I just take this page, that is where the scholarship says, and the final website is not the scholarship, or only the scholarship is one of that. They are very complex objects that we need to take into consideration. And even our comment and understanding of it, you need to be part of it. So I'm not sure you can separate, as you were saying, the level of the edition and the level that the editor thinking about the edition and the doing of the edition. If you want to go back to the print world, there was always a part of the editor presenting his idea of editing, the consideration of the text, the presentation of the evidence. It's just that the print world has given a standardized way for presenting this model, the data model, and the evidences. Otherwise, we are inventing a new one because our tools are different.
Well, I think we're talking about different things here. We're talking about the interpretation and the edition, and which is another thing than to say we have different aspects of the edition. But this was my.
Well, I was just sort of agreeing with that point and sort of resisting this introduction of the edition as a category because I don't know that it was helping. But I think there's a connection between some of the comments that Steve was making and your comment about having sort of measures of quality or measures at which we sort of consider there's a sort of no further dividend to be gained. And sort of Laura's comment that we're sort of modeling in the hope that some visualization or analysis will appear that will have made our modeling worthwhile. And I think rather than sort of continuing to model forward and hoping that that appears, to think hard about the interaction between our modeling and these kind of points or standards, reformulated in this new digital space for, what is good enough, or where is there sort of loss of traction.
And I just I know I'm interrupting, but I think squaring this particular circle here, I don't think Fotis is right, but I don't think you're wrong either. I think what you're describing is a particular approach to the discipline of editing. And there are many possible disciplines of editing which can be defended on their own terms, which may differ with that particular approach, but which on their own terms are perfectly legitimate and may also have a disciplinary basis. And so, it's like, I don't think that we're really disagreeing on any fundamental level, Elena and you and I and Trevor, with respect to, differentiating between the presentation, the editing, the commentaries, and so forth and so on. But I do think that particular kind of distinction is something that is realized in the instance, rather than being something that we can prescribe for all time, all editing up front.
Yeah. Lunch. We are doing this at lunch.
Following up on that, I raised my hand because I wanted to agree and disagree with Fotis. I did sense in your presentation, Trevor, that you shifted from having your digital humanities hat on, to having your library archives hat on in the middle, and talked about preserving all this context. But I heard your earlier point, kind of underscored by Michael later, as being that even if we don't preserve it, we should understand it as a rhetorical act, and as in the context of lots of stuff that is not necessarily captured there, but it's enabled by it. And I think you could trace this back to book history and say, okay, your commentary it may be different from the edition proper, if you want to see it that way, but it assumes a publishing context, and it assumes the cost of publishing and the availability of audiences and printing media and that sort of thing. And it's all of those constraints that shape the rhetorical act of expression.
I'm refraining myself.
So building on the idea of markup as rhetorical act, I kept actually thinking of speech act theory when you were making that argument. So it's sort of illocutionary act. J.L. Austin's doing things as words. An illocutionary act is when you say something, you do something. So if we just simply list, what the debates are, it feels a little bit more non-committal. It feels like you're putting a stake in the ground once you've actually had to represent it. So it's representational versus something else like exegetical. And so it just feels like you're raising the stakes by actually, representing the composition history in some way in your markup. So I don't know. The example, I know you were not thrilled with the example of an edition, but I think of like A.E. Hausman editing someone like Ovid, where he makes a conjecture and he inserts his conjecture directly in the text instead of confining it to the apparatus of the text. And there's something, kind of dangerous about it that I think I find appealing. So.
Yes, ma'am.
This point that has been made, when you started, you said we worked up from the manuscript as the first step of looking at the zones and representing that, because that's the original material that you saw, also as the document. Then you quoted this Carol Palmer text, which seemed to indicate that in fact what was really needed was the opposite, that the user and the user's needs, whoever the user is, you have to determine that first of all, who are the users, are they maybe ordinary people rather than scholars? What kind of information do they want out of the text? And then work down towards the data model, and then decide what to encode. And I guess if I come out from the conversation getting in the clarity that I see it, that what we're writing is software. There are users at the end, but we have to think of engineering in terms of satisfying all the needs first, rather than thinking very closely about how to encode the text first, and then thinking, oh, there are users, we must present that in some way to the user to broadcast that. They're actually the first people to think about it.
Well, I don't know that a strong either-or answer there satisfies me very well. I mean, I think as Doug was pointing out, I have a hard time keeping one hat on versus the other. I mean, the DH person versus the librarian. And I think, in Carol's elaboration of this idea in the paper, I think there's a sort of much more well-developed argument about user communities and thinking about user needs and how that interacts with the ways that scientists in this case are using the data as they generate it and using it for their own purposes, and the way that interacts with, you know, the reuse or use by others later. But I think this is an area that there's probably a fuzzy part in the middle between those two approaches that needs reinventing or re-examining or further work on it at the very least.
What a discussion. Thank you all. We have lunch break. Yeah.